Welcome everybody to this midday webinar, 1 o'clock webinar for the Howard League. It's my great pleasure to be the Chief Executive of the Howard League, Andrea Coomber, and today we're joined by Tristan Kirk, who is the Courts Correspondent for the London Evening Standard, where he's been since 2016. So a pretty interesting time for courts. And in addition to writing just in the Evening Standard, Tristan is big in the Twitter sphere. I'm sure many of you would be following him. And so today we're going to talk about some of his observations, what he's seeing in court over the last period. I'm going to ask Tristan some questions. At the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll talk for about half an hour, Tristan, if that's okay. And then there'll be a chance for people in the audience to ask questions. Please put the questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Use the chat for other things, to share your other views or things you want to do with other participants. But please put your questions into the Q&A box and we'll get to them. Invariably, the Q&A box is very slow to fill up until the very end, when we are overrun with questions and won't get through them. So if you've got something you're burning to ask, please get it in quick. Great. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for joining us today from the Royal Courts of Justice, a very kind of austere and serious looking backdrop for you.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me.
So why don't we start by you talking about how you came to be a court correspondent and what that involves?
Well, I started my career as a journalist on local newspapers in North London. So I was covering the whole gamut of news and other things, and did some court reporting as part of that role, as anybody who's ever worked in local newspapers will know. And then when I came to the end of that time, I joined an agency. I was looking for a sort of a step up to something different. I joined a court agency called Central News, which is based at the Old Bailey and covers courts and tribunals around London, and that was mainly a way of just doing something different with my career. I wasn't necessarily looking to go into courts as a niche, essentially. But then I found that it was really good fun. It was interesting. It was work that I enjoyed and found was quite valuable. And then come 2016, I got picked up by the Evening Standard. The job came available, and haven't looked back since.
And what do you like about it? I mean, you said it was you find it enjoyable, because I was in court yesterday for the day. It wasn't that enjoyable.
Well, in the job that I'm in at the moment, I get to cover pretty much all of the big cases that are going on around London, at the High Court, Supreme Court, sometimes outside of London. So I have a sort of a front row of the most interesting cases, the most high profile ones that I've covered recently, Boris Becker being sent to jail, MPs being accused of various things, as MPs tend to be. I've been covering the Rwanda deportation battle today. And so it's wide, it's varied. It tends to be the stories that are either at the top of the news agenda or are quite high up. So I also cover the Magistrates court as well, and I appreciate what you say about it not necessarily being the most interesting of time. But in the Magistrates court is I think a good dichotomy of life and those kind of disputes and problems and issues that come up that don't necessarily get to court. There is examples of the problems in society, of the things where people fall out, where something bad happens, of course. So you get to see a wide range of issues, and those obviously are stories for anybody who works in the newspaper or the media industry. And I like the challenge of finding amongst the tens or even hundreds of thousands of things that are going on in the courts, the interesting and the important and the unusual. I think those are the three sort of categories I'd pick out, and that's kind of the skill that I have and bring to the job. And I don't know, I find that to be an exciting challenge, and something that I hope is valued by people.
I definitely found the Magistrates Court interesting. I just didn't find it enjoyable. It was for reasons we can perhaps get onto a bit later. These are sort of pretty depressing times to be in the Mags Court, I think, in pretty much every way, let alone on a degree day.
Well, I mean, let me say that almost every case that I cover, especially in the criminal sphere, it involves somebody in the dock, or probably having the one of the worst days of their lives. I do appreciate that, obviously, and that said, you are there for the public and to show that it's quite important, I think, that the public see what's going on in their justice system, know what's going on, to not only see what the crimes are that have been committed, but also to be able to say, that's not right, maybe there's something going wrong in the system here. And so I think there is an importance to that, and it's not a laugh a minute, but there's an enjoyable challenge there.
Sure. So the Boris Becker or the Rebecca Vardy is always going to be a big story.
Yes.
How do you go about dealing with Crown Courts or Magistrates Courts? How do you have a sense of where you should be and what the human stories that will become news stories for you will be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a human element to every story. It makes it a good story. You're looking, I think, for things that are out of the ordinary, things that are going to pique people's interest. There's sort of a top level of stories which are in the public domain, and the murder cases, the high-profile crimes that you kind of can't miss. And then below that, you've got to look for things that perhaps won't get seen, won't get promoted by the police or prosecutors in press releases, things that you can draw out that will capture people's attention. So, unfortunately, in London, sort of a stabbing is not an unusual occurrence. So if I was to look at a sort of a stabbing case, then you would look at the surrounding circumstances of the stabbing. Is this something that's slightly out of the ordinary? Is the person who's done it or accused of doing it, are they a notable person or somebody who's out of the ordinary, run of the mill, people who commit these kind of crimes? A burglary case, it sounds kind of obvious to me. I'm sorry if it is obvious to everybody else, but obviously if a famous person's mansion has been burgled, then that's the kind of burglary case that you would focus on, rather than somebody else's house. There's obviously, sadly, a lot of burglary cases. So it's about finding that little nugget that you would put into the top line of your story. I suppose the best way I can describe it is, if you look at a court case, how would you describe it in one line? Well, that would tend to be the intro to any story I would write. And if I'm struggling to write the story in one line, then perhaps it isn't an interesting enough story for the readers.
And do you have a sense of what your readers are interested in when it comes to courts? I mean, other than celebrities or...
Yeah, it's not just the celebrities or the famous cases. The way that our system works, certainly our online system works, is that we have a lot of analytics of what people are reading and what they're interested in. So you can draw from that and see cases that are capturing people's attention. But I think generally crime stories, and especially court stories, tend to get big numbers online, because I think it's an area that the public don't necessarily go into. They don't really know what's going on. And inside of those areas where the public often aren't, are told the most dramatic stories and therefore the most sort of interesting and fascinating reads. So I think that's why there's such an attention on court stories, because there's less people see these things. And if we were there,
it's funny
then
because you can just go sit in the public gallery, and yet, I mean, how often do you see people who aren't relatives of the defendant or victim sitting in the public gallery? I mean, are the public
in a word, not very often. I think the Old Bailey lets a few sort of tourists through, come along and have a look, but mainly because that's a famous courthouse and not because necessarily. I mean, gone are the days, long gone are the days of the packed public gallery come to see justice being done in the community. I mean, let's be honest, there aren't even courthouses in a lot of communities these days because they've all been shut down. So the idea of local justice and people seeing it being done is dead and buried. And so what we've got now is sort of, you've got to rely on a journalistic industry that will bring out these kind of stories, and other ways that perhaps we'll get on to discussing, that where openness and transparency can actually be actively promoted by the court itself. Perhaps where there isn't a journalist in the room, but there's a story still to be told.
And for the people who are watching who perhaps aren't going and sitting in their local court, who is in court and what have they done? I mean, what are the kind of themes you see day in, day out in our court system?
Oh, that's quite a broad question. I mean, the whole range, I think, if you were to sort of drop down to the magistrates' court, you'd get, burglaries, robberies, antisocial behaviour. At the moment, a lot of people are coming through the magistrates' courts charged with protesting, the Just Stop Oil people, Extinction Rebellion. That's taken up quite a lot of court time at the moment. You've obviously got, a vast number of drug charges and that kind of, and then there's the street violence, those kind of cases. So there's the whole range. I mean, you think of it, then we see it in the Crown Courts in London and in the magistrates.
And you've been at the stand, you've been doing this job for, oh, my maths is bad, like 6 years?
6 years, 6.5 now,
yeah. There we go. And that's been over this period of COVID, where we've had, as we know, kind of a record level backlog in the Crown Courts, moving with more proceedings online. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about what you've seen over the last few years in the courts, or what you haven't seen that you'd like to be seeing.
Yeah, well, when I started, the backlog in the criminal courts is something that's it's quite high on the agenda at the moment, especially with the barrister strike and that kind of thing. Well, when I started reporting for the Standard, the backlog was down in the 30,000s. You'd expect a case to go from magistrates through the Crown and be resolved within a year. Generally, averagely, you'd expect it to come up quite quickly, get a trial date and be set. And it's gradually deteriorated over the sort of 2018 to 2019 through to 2020, when they were cutting back on the amount of sitting days in the Crown Courts. And they actually closed down Blackfriars Crown Court, one of our Crown Courts, probably one of our best Crown Courts, was shut down. And that was sort of a few signs of that deterioration in the system, which is quite sad to see. It's demoralising, really. In London, you've got quite a lot of crime. You've got the backlog of cases. You've got lots of people who are relying on this system, and you're seeing them cutting back on sitting days, and the wait gets longer and longer. And then obviously COVID came along, and now the wait is hard to describe, really. It's ridiculous, really, that it's now not necessarily routine, but it's not out of the ordinary to find that an allegation of a crime, in 2018, is going to be tried next year. So some of the complainant or victim in that case will have waited 5 years for any kind of justice. That's just totally wrong. On anyone's level, surely, and there does seem to be a sort of lack of drive to really get to the root of how we can fix this problem.
And for you, how much is the kind of failure in the system, the backlogs, the sort of people being unprepared, wasted time, all of that stuff? How much is that itself a story? Can that be a story? Does the public care about that? Well,
I think so. Yeah, certainly at the moment. I've been writing about that for sort of the last two or 3 years, because those are stories that are quite difficult, I think, to write initially, because if if your story is about courts delays, adjournments, all these kind of words. They're the kind of words you try and avoid using. They turn people off. It's a bit dull. Or a court case has been put back a few months. Well, kind of that. You can imagine the reader shrugging that. But you drill down. You get to the people. You get to the victims, the witnesses, the defendants as well. It's important not to forget them. And they're just stuck in this system that clearly isn't working. And can you imagine, if you were the victim of a crime today, say someone burgled your house, like maybe burgled your house, you would obviously report that. But say you were the victim of something that you would weigh up whether to report it. And if you were told at that stage that you might be in the justice system having to wait to give evidence for 3 years or 4 years, and you might be called to court on multiple occasions for it not to take place, and all these kind of things, the kind of indecision of the system, the delays, the not knowing what's going on. You can imagine how you would maybe think to yourself, well, it's not worth the bother. Let's not put myself through that, because I'm just being victimized even further.
Yeah. And with all of that, I mean, obviously, hopefully everybody watching knows this is a system from which there's been significant retrenchment of public funds over sort of 20, 30 years now, but no more time than now. And what do you see that doing to morale in the system? We know about the barristers' strike, criminal barristers' strike, for example. But do you see litigants in person? Where are you seeing those struggles as you sit in courts day in, day out?
But if I'm honest, that's the kind of thing that I don't necessarily see, because you don't see too often the anguish of a witness being told, in a room round the back by a police officer that, oh yes, you've come to court. It's not happening again, and we'll go off for another 6 months. But you do come across it, from time to time. I remember speaking to a victim of historic sexual offences. I think he'd been to court 4 times to try and speak at the sentencing hearing, and just the anguish and the hurt, and he was suffering terrible anxiety, but he was absolutely determined this is his moment to confront the guy who did it, and he must have his day in court. But he was being put through the ringer, and that was just it just seemed terrible, really. And a court system, a proper justice system that's working and is working for victims, should be able to give that kind of certainty that if we put down a hearing, it's actually going to take place, come what may. You will get your moment, and we won't make you wait and wait and wait.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier sort of transparency and openness. I mean, these are obviously fundamental principles for any functioning justice system. I mean, what threats have you seen to those principles over your time being in the courts?
I think there's two parts to this. One is the government reforms, I call them that, and the second bit is the sort of the gradual ebbing away through efficiency of transparency. I'll come to that secondly if I remember. The government reforms, they've done 2 things. One, in 2014, 2015, they introduced something called the Single Justice Procedure. And just this year, the Judicial Review and Courts Act was passed. And that is, as I see it, building on the Single Justice Procedure idea. And both of those things are taking away transparency and visibility of the court system.
Can you just explain for those who are watching what the Single Justice Procedure, how it works?
Yes, of course. I'll refer to it as SJP, if that's all right. So that's slightly easier to say and shorter. So the SJP system, has taken in around about 60% of all cases in the Magistrates' Court that all used to be heard in open court, and transformed transformed them into a written procedure. So whereas before, magistrates would sit in court as normal, defendants would stand in front of them or not, there'd be a prosecutor explaining the case, and then it'd be dealt with and sentenced. These are for the low-level offences, so driving offences, not having a ticket on a train, not paying your TV licence. Nowadays, taking electronic scooters onto trains, putting your bike on the train, all these kind of stuff, a wide variety. But as I say, 60% of the magistrate's work used to all be in open court is now a written procedure. So a single magistrate sits behind closed doors, away from any kind of anybody watching, and just deals with cases on the papers, as it's said, and sentences them. So there's no defendant in the room. You know, if they'd chosen to turn up before, there's no prosecutor there, and they're reducing the amount of interaction between the magistrates and the legal advisor in that. Now, there's a lot of questions. We could talk for ages about SJP and questions about how it's run. I can talk just purely from a media point of view. As a reporter, I would look at the sort of the magistrates list way back when, you know, when it was an open court, and I'd maybe spot a case that I fancied going in, and I'd go along to the magistrates court and I'd sit and I'd listen to it, and then I'd report on it in the usual way. Well, now it's all of these cases have been bunched up into this massive big list of cases, huge lists from all over the country. So simply finding a case that you're interested in is hard enough because of the way that they have basically washed away the locality of the hearings and put them into this massive list. But then you have to make a disclosure application to the court to get hold of the documents that have been used in the case to be able to tell any kind of a story. So whereas that open court hearing, I could report on a case that morning, you know, go in, type it up on my laptop, and then done, send it off to be filed. Now it's a sort of a process that can take anywhere between 24 hours and 9 months to complete, depending on when anybody gets back and replies to your request. Now, that system is problematic and was introduced basically on a promise that nobody cares about any of these cases. Well, yeah. We do. And the reason that we cared was because not only are those crimes, the low-level ones I've mentioned, going to be in it, but it actually got used for all the COVID offences. All the people who broke the lockdown rules were also put through the single justice procedure. I mean, I'm sure I don't need to explain that those are cases that are not only of interest, they're of the highest public interest, and they might be technically classified as low level, but they are they're not
capable of bringing down a government potentially.
Well, exactly. I mean, if anybody from the government ended up in there, but I suppose the point is that if anybody from Downing Street had ended up not paying a COVID fine and going through this system, I'm not entirely sure that anybody would have noticed because of the lack of transparency in the system and the way that how difficult it is to find these cases. And I'm sorry, I'm going on, but the second part is the Judicial Review and Courts Act, which has introduced a new online system whereby first appearances of various magistrates' court cases where the defendant would traditionally come into the court. The charge would be read out, the prosecutor would explain what the case is about, and then various directions would be made, and perhaps they'd enter a plea or indicate a plea, and then it'd be sent off to the Crown Court. Well, now that's going to be transformed into an online system as well. So a series of messages, emails, privately sent between lawyers that we are potentially going to have to try and get disclosed from the court to report on essentially a magistrate's first appearance. So what's happening is that the entry
how can you do that in a way that's not sort of a phishing? I mean,
Well, the details are still being fleshed out, and we have had a commitment. We had a public commitment from the now former Justice Minister James Cartledge that open justice will be protected, but the negotiations still going on as to how that will be. But whatever we come up with at the end of it, it's still not going to be an open court hearing anymore. It's not going to have that kind of visibility and transparency that we would have before. It's going to be a spreadsheet of cases where you'd have to work really, really hard to find those cases that you'd be interested in. And you said earlier on about you went down to the Magistrates Court and you sat in and you listened to what was going on. Well, not anymore for those cases, and will the casual observer or even the interested observer know that there's a big spreadsheet of cases that used to be open court hearings and technically still have transparency, but don't really anymore. There's going to be a lot of work to be done if those kind of reforms are going to.
I can remember being in discussion.
Visibility.
Yeah, I can remember being in early discussions about this at MOJ, and they'd say, well, nobody goes to those. Nobody's sitting in the public gallery anyway, therefore it's okay. And it's that disconnect between the principle of it and what may happen in practice.
That is unfortunately that, as we said, there's been a tailing off of people going. I think that at some stage the court's got the idea that there was no journalists at all going to the magistrates. There was a minister who stood up in Parliament back in 2015, and he said something to that effect, that journalists don't cover the Magistrates Court anymore, which is just flat out untrue, frankly. Yeah. But there is that image, and so with that, then eventually you get to the idea that, well, maybe we don't need to have these hearings at all. Maybe we can just do it between ourselves. Well, that's not open justice. That's not what we're supposed to be protecting. And sorry, there was a second bit I was going to say. It was sort of the gradual whittling away of openness. And this isn't necessarily some sort of underhand thing that's going on. But I think as digitisation progresses, the courts are more and more relying on things like prosecution notes, defence notes, written submissions being handed up or being uploaded to the digital case system. And so whereas something might necessarily in the past have had to have been read out or vocally, sort of explained, and so the journalist at the back could have written it down. Now it's not, because the judge will come in and say, "Oh, thank you very much for your notes. I've read them. Anything to add?" And so the journalist has got the notebook open but nothing to write. And then we have to start making disclosure applications to try and get hold of those written notes. And that's unfortunately the future. And I think there needs to be a sort of a shift in the way that journalists approach court reporting, because that's simply happening. That's just the way it's gone.
And does the move towards doing more online or through televised thing, does that make your job easier in a way? Like, you can get to different courts in a day. Presumably you're not spending your whole day.
Oh, do you mean sort of remote video link
remote
courts?
Video hearings, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting development. That's something that, so when the pandemic started, the Ministry of Justice, to their absolute credit, and the court service, embraced the idea of video hearings simply as a necessity, right, more than anything else. And now those, the idea of having video links to court hearings and sometimes having entirely remote hearings has been written into law and is now something that will forever be an option for the courts. I see my job, and I certainly think that most court reporters will still see their job as being in court. There's certain things that you can't do when you're on a video link. You can't have a quick chat with the prosecutor. You can't, easily ask the clerk for some information. There's some certain things you can't see on the video link. Sometimes there's things you can't hear on the video link. So, that's where the main part of the job still will be. But I really think there is a role for video links for the future that, if I say I'm, the High Court for a hearing and, when this finishes at 2:00, I could, in theory, dial into Harrow Crown Court for a sentencing hearing. Well, if I didn't have the option of dialing into that sentencing hearing, The reality is, although it will have been taking place in open court and everything will have been said out loud, no journalist will have been there, so nobody will have heard it.
Yeah.
And so, I see that, that's an addition, a welcome addition that you can add to the role, to be in court for the main part, for whatever it is you need to be there for, but fit in other hearings around other places. Why not? It increases the amount of reporting, amount of knowledge of what's going on in the justice system, and as long as it's not causing an impact, then I think it should be warmly welcomed and encouraged. Great.
Now we have lots of questions already, which is lovely to see. So I'll start at the top. So Nina has said the Justice Select Committee are currently doing an inquiry into public understanding of sentencing. What's your view on the role of court reporters in influencing public understanding and views of sentencing? Also, what more could be done to support court reporters to report constructively and sensitively, which the CJA, when Nina works, leads, has done through its media awards? I mean, how much is that? Do you consider part of it, I guess?
I think that certainly on Twitter and social media in the last few years, I think there's been a bit of a movement to call out, particularly from the legal profession, where reporters have not reported cases in a way that's faithful to the way that a case has been sentenced. So various things are said in a sentencing hearing, and put across. And I think there's sometimes a temptation from some reporters is to take a particular line or point and inflate that so that it is the top line of the story, and to give it, dramatically more importance than it really deserves. And so I think that personally, I think that calling out of when that's done and saying, well, this is wrong, this isn't an accurate picture, is quite important to do, because it informs the public's understanding of how the justice system works. So, if it was, a story about, I'm not sure, to be honest, but, there's lots of examples of, somebody being let off and being, when they've. So I suppose the best example I could give is that it's often reported that somebody's been spared jail or let off from a jail sentence, and then when you drill down into what they were actually sentenced to, it's for a crime that would only ever really have attracted a community order. They were never in danger of going to prison. I seem to remember. I'm sorry if this is not quite 100%, but Katie Price has had many legal travails recently, and there was a bit of speculation about whether she might go to prison for breaching a restraining order. Well, she was charged in a completely separate case with speeding, and that was reported as, and then she was sentenced to what speeding offences are always sentenced to, which is a fine, and that was reported as Katie Price dodges jail again. And I thought that's just completely wrong. And so, it's calling out of that. But I think the second part, what can be done to increase public understanding, is to basically show people the working of how judges pass these sentences. Now, in most, not in most, but in a lot of Crown Court hearings, sentencing hearings these days, the judge will have taken the time to actually type up their sentencing remarks, and they will actually just read them out, and yet those sentencing remarks very rarely, unless it's the really high-profile cases, get published. And I for one don't see why that couldn't start to be more of a formality, more of a norm. If you've gone to the trouble of, and they'll say it, you're in court, and they'll say, the judge will get to the end and say, I've typed out my sentencing remarks and I'll upload them to the digital case system. And I look from the press bench and think to myself, well, why can't we have them then? And you know, it's frustrating because that helps people to understand why you've come to a particular decision more than I can often include in a news story. Actually, I can't get everything in. I can't get I often don't report the sentencing guidelines and how those have been applied. So that's how I would start off by educating people. Is you know, encourage judges to be more open about their decisions.
Yeah, and I remember Lord Justice Fulford's sentencing remarks when he sentenced Wayne Couzens to a whole life term were published in their entirety. It didn't stop some people on Twitter taking particular bits and running away.
No, it doesn't. I mean, those high-profile cases are often, and I think that, you know, when a case has been reported and it's perhaps not been reported in a particularly sensible way, then it does enable people. I know you don't want to encourage social media wars, but it does enable people to come back and say, hang on a minute, this is actually what he said. Are you sure this is right?
Yeah. Loads of questions. Thank you for getting your questions in early. You're very good. How well do police officers present oral evidence in magistrates' courts?
How well?
How well?
Is
that a too general a question for you?
I think I'd just say that you know, police officers are obviously, you know, doing their job, but there is a sort of a police speak way that police officers come across. You know, there's a formality to their evidence. That's, you know, just a casual observation, I suppose. Is but they
talk like police officers, don't they?
Well, they do. One thing, you know, certainly with the COVID offences and with you know, single justice procedure, and I've obtained a lot of documents, a lot of witness statements from police officers, and they are of a similar ilk, almost without exception, actually. So they're written in a certain way, which obviously is perhaps how they've been trained to do, but it does it does come across in a certain way. You know, when you're reading a police officer's witness statements, and there's a sort of a lack of maybe a lack of humanity is a little strong, but I'm struggling for the words. You know,
there's a woodenness.
It's not quite normal.
No, there's like a little bit robotic. I've always found police officers' evidence.
Yeah, and you do often find police officers are, you know, when they're giving evidence, they stick to their guns, which, you know, obviously they're entitled to do, but you do find they can be quite stubborn witnesses, depending on the circumstances.
A couple of questions about, I mean, understandably, about transparency and open justice. So maybe this one, how do you think the principle of open justice could be promoted or revived in light of your comment about public attendance in court being dead and buried? I mean, what can we do to get, do we need to get people into courts, into public galleries? I mean, how else could we promote open justice?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, really, because it's you know, it's up to the people to be interested enough. I think that one of the first steps you could take is to make knowledge of what's going on in the criminal justice system just much broader. So take a Crown Court, for example. If you you know, lived in a particular town that had a Crown Court, and you maybe had a passing interest in looking in on the Crown Court and hearing some of the cases, you could go online and you look up the list of the next day's court hearings, and all it would tell you is the person's name. I mean, unless you particularly knew that person, there's nothing there to really draw you in to say, oh yeah, okay, I'll go down and have a listen. I think that one of the easiest and steps that the Ministry of Justice and the Court Service could take is to start listing cases at the Crown Court with the charges next to them. Yeah. I don't think that breaks any reporting restrictions. It doesn't cause any problems. If there's somebody at the Crown Court in you know, in Coventry who's accused of murder, some people of Coventry might want to hear about that. You know, if there's a so if there's a particular, you know, crime or type of crime that they're interested in, then you know, they might want to go down to that. I don't know, just expanding the amount of knowledge that people have about what's going on, because at the moment it's a bit of a closed shop. You know, we get sent lists of cases and tell us all about them, and then we decide which one to go along to. But the public don't really get any kind of assistance or help at all.
Yeah.
It is difficult because you can't just start, sort of spraying out, thousands of people's information onto the internet, without any safeguards. But I think there is actually a process underway at the moment with HMCTS, the court service, to do that, what I'm saying. But I think that's one of the first steps you could take.
Yeah. Gwyneth asks, in lieu of the public gallery, can members of the public dial into online court hearings in the way you can as a journalist?
They can, yes. And I think that's something that people just simply don't know about. You can, in the same way, it's probably going to be harder for a member of the public to do it, I'll be honest with you, because there's a trust barrier that you have to overcome. But when I want to join all this information is actually published online, so I'm not sharing any trade secrets here. When I want to join a hearing, if it's on the list as a video link case, then I'll drop an email over to the Crown Court saying, I'm a journalist, I'd like to join this hearing via video link. I'll attach a copy of my press card, and thanks very much. Sometimes they'll come back and ask, is there a particular reason why you'd like to join by a video link? But more often than not, they'll just say yes, here's the link. Now, a member of the public could do exactly the same as me. There are rules around court hearings. You're not allowed to film. You're not allowed to get your phone out in court, physical court hearings, start taking pictures or videos or record proceedings, on a voice note. And those rules extend to video links as well. Now, whereas this chat we're having right now is being recorded and anybody could take a picture of me if they so desired, or record the whole thing, you couldn't do that at all at court. And I think that there's a sort of a distinct worry certainly among the judiciary and among the court service generally, is that if this becomes a normal thing to do, that people might start breaking the rules and they don't really know what they would do about that. But that's something for them to consider. But yes, in theory, if you're interested and you want to dial in, then the only way to find out is by asking.
That reminds me, I failed to say at the beginning that we are recording this. We'll go onto our YouTube channel. I apologise for anybody who's surprised by that news. It's quite standard for us. Thank you. Philippa asks, you mentioned the criminal barrister strike over legal aid, and solicitors are also in dispute. Neither sides of the profession typically have huge amounts of public sympathy. Where do you see the dispute going?
Yeah, I mean, Philip is right that the idea of sympathy for a lawyer is hard to overcome. I think because there's a sort of an entrenched view among the public that somehow lawyers are
Raylan called us
fantastically remunerated. I mean, in criminal justice, it's simply not the case, and I think it's important to state that over and over again, is that the fees that especially people who are on legal aid work are very, very low. I was in a meeting earlier this week where barristers were talking about going to work and essentially paying for the privilege of doing their work, sort of getting £100–120 fee, out of which they have to pay for their train fare, a hotel room potentially, they have to pay tax on it, they have to pay chambers fees, and then all of a sudden that's gone. So £126 for a day, might be all right if you didn't have to take all of that off it because they're all self-employed.
Yeah, and they end up paying 25 quid for the day. Pleasure.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I think the first challenge is to overcome the idea of the public's idea that somehow barristers don't deserve, and solicitors as well, they do often get left out of the conversation, don't deserve it. But how's the conversation going to go in the future? Well, there's a press release just gone out, so I'm just looking at it now, and it would appear, unless I've misjudged it, that the government is digging in, certainly on the barristers' strike. They are they're sticking to a 15% fee increase, which would come in September, but wouldn't apply to cases already in the system. So if we talked about this great backlog and cases going off for a year or two, so they won't see those fee rises for quite a long time indeed. Where do I see it going? Well, yeah, that's where I think that the government are right now, and they're going to the recess. So certainly over the summer, they're going to stick to their guns and hope for the best, really. But I mean, I've never quite seen anything like it in the 10 years that I've been reporting on legal affairs and in and around barristers. It's very, very unusual for lawyers to go out on strike, because it's kind of like I'm not criticizing anyway, it's abandoning the duty, isn't it? You've got to be there. You have to be there. That if you're not there, then the people in courts who are, sometimes the most vulnerable and helpless in society just don't stand a chance. So for them to actually take the step to go on strike, and for it to be such a lengthy, such a deep action of, this week, all 5 days they're walking out, and then, in 2 weeks' time, another 5 days of walkouts, and on and on and on. It's like, well, that is an extraordinary thing for them to have done, and they know the impact this will have.
Yeah.
I think that potentially what we'll see is a new government forming, and perhaps and a fresh appreciation that something more than what's been offered needs to be put onto the table.
Yeah. Sorry, many more questions. Do you perceive the decrease in transparency as a threat to the integrity of justice in the courts?
Yes, absolutely. Because
Yep.
Because if we can't see what's happening, then we don't know what's going wrong, or indeed what's going right. Let's be honest. But take the SJP cases with COVID crimes. Now, they decided to do it in the SJP system in April, May 2020, and at that time they knew that there would be, from their own sort of minutes of their meetings within government, there'd be an error rate. Mistakes were going to be made. People were going to be wrongly prosecuted, wrongly convicted. They knew that, and they put it into a system which they also knew was very hard for anyone to see what was going on. Excuse me. There's a lack of transparency, and they did it anyway. And when you started looking into those cases, that you really started digging in and getting the paperwork out, you found that people were being prosecuted under the wrong laws. They were being prosecuted for offences that they hadn't actually committed. There was just it's unbelievable, really, just how much there was. I didn't go into reporting on the COVID offences with a view to finding things that are going wrong. I went in because it was it's a new area of law. It's an area that people are obviously going to be interested in. Let's see what's going on. Let's see what people have been doing. What are these gatherings? What's been going on? And it's just time after time you'd find, well, hang on a minute. That's some of the early ones. That's the Welsh law that somebody's been prosecuted under for something they did in London, or we weren't in tier 4 at the time. We were in step 1, and you've used the wrong law. Well, if you're using the wrong law, if you're getting something totally, basically fundamental wrong, then what else has gone wrong? Things that we can't necessarily discern from the paperwork that we're presented with. And so that's sort of like a small example of a wider problem. Is if we can't see what's going on, and journalists do act as a bit of a sort of a scrutiny level on how the whole justice system is working and what people are being prosecuted for. There was an issue a few years ago to do with disclosure of documents, really big problem with disclosure of documents. And, defense lawyers were bringing that out, but it was journalists who were able to sort of really promote that to the public, to tell people what was going wrong in those cases, and there was a sort of a systemic problem that needed fixing. Well, that's the kind of thing that will just get washed away under the carpet if we can't have open court hearings, or at the very least, transparent access to what's going on behind closed doors.
Great. I'm sorry, there are so many questions here. I mean, Kath's asked a question about IPPs. Presumably you're not seeing IPPs because they're not coming before the courts anymore.
They're not. They're not my area of specialty, I'll be honest with you. But I certainly reported on a few way back when. I've seen them being passed, and I find it quite baffling that they still exist, that people are still in prison under IPP. So it means basically they are in prison until somebody decides that they're safe enough to be freed. And there are some. It seems to me to be a terrible injustice that somebody could be sentenced to 2 years in prison on an IPP sentence, and 20 years later still be there. So there may well be a case to be made that that person is dangerous and needs to be sort of monitored, managed, maybe even still imprisoned. There may well be that case. That was not the sort of what was sentenced back in the day. It was 2 years. So when a prisoner, when a defendant's in the dock, they get 2 years. I can't imagine there's any expectation that they would still be there 20 years later. And so that goes to fairness.
Yeah, it really does.
Anything else.
The great stain, as Lord Brown calls it.
I can't believe that they haven't been abolished and converted to something else.
10 years since it's been abolished this December, but we still have 3,000 people in prison on IPP sentences. Just terrible. And as Kath said in her message, recalled. For no necessary.
Where's the hope? Where's the rehabilitation? How is somebody supposed to even approach getting, sort of putting their life back together when they've no idea if they're ever going to get out of prison? Absolutely.
Somebody who has chosen to remain anonymous, which is fine, asks where the 60% JSP cases comes from. It would be helpful to be able to reference this, presumably for some article.
Yeah. So it fluctuates. That it was 56% a few years ago, and I think it's increased slightly. It's in the Ministry of Justice data, and there's been various reports on it. So 60% is a bit of a rough figure, but it's certainly over 50%, and I think well over that, so around the 60% mark. But it's in the data. They have sort of spreadsheets that breaks it down.
Great. And then Rob's asked a question about the relationship between policies and outcomes in the criminal justice system. Is the state of the justice system currently experiencing, which we've been discussing, legal aid crisis, barristers striking, courts and justice, down to bad policies implemented by government? I mean, where do you see the source of all of these bills, Tristan? Share.
Well, I mean, so taking the legal aid crisis and the barrister strikes, yes, that's down to government policies over a sustained period. Let's be honest, it's not just this current government, it's previous governments, but there has been a long period where criminal justice, particularly the courts, has dropped down the priorities list and seen as somewhere that can be squeezed, can be underfunded, to a certain extent. So if we look at it started with there's closures of court buildings across the country. I think around about half the courts around the country were shut down. The consolidating of the amount of people who work in the system, the staff, and then that goes on to the amount of fees paid in legal aid to barristers, to solicitors, and all of that, I think, builds up to a system that's not being well looked after, and is not flexible, and cannot react to problems, to stress testing. And so, whereas certainly in recent years, there's been a lot of policy announcements from the government to do with prisons, to do with police, and to do with introducing new laws and new crimes. Those are often, I think, policy announcements that are designed to grab a headline and to say that we're tough on crime and we are the party of law and order and justice. But it's much more difficult to grab a headline about, properly maintaining a court building or pumping money into legal aid fees. And so therefore, it's kind of like having a sandwich with no filling. It's all very well saying we're going to hire lots and lots of police officers and they've got lots of brand new laws to prosecute people with, and then we're going to put lots of people in prison. But if they can't get through the court system and, in any proper way, then you've got a system that doesn't work. It's got to be, I think somebody said recently, it's got to be a holistic system. It's all got to be properly funded for it to work in totality. Otherwise, you get the kind of problems that we're suffering now. And when I talk about stress testing, I mean, obviously things were going wrong before COVID, but when the pandemic came along, then it was just the crisis spiraled out of control. And now well, I don't know what the fix is. I'm not going to start pontificating on policy too much, but there needs to be a sort of a commitment, a long-term commitment to not just to the sort of the sexier ends of criminal justice, but to say, we're gonna fund the whole lot. I mean, I think there's a £1 billion backlog in maintenance repairs in the Crown Court, in not just Crown Courts, actually maybe in the Courts of State. That's an astonishing state of affairs.
Yeah, I mean, there are courts in this city where there are buckets lined up every time it rains. I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
elevators that have never worked ever.
Isleworth Crown Court had a sort of a leaking from the ceiling, a sort of a slalom going on in the corridor for quite some time. Snaresbrook Crown Court at the moment I'm not sure whether it's held together by scaffolding, but it's certainly got a lot of it. And they're going to have to shut down parts of Woolwich Crown Court soon to fix the aircon or the ventilation system. It's not a great state of affairs. And
it isn't. I mean, the problem is these are meant to be buildings, aren't they, where justice is dispensed and where the grandeur and the solemnity of our justice system is meant to be exhibited, where people have their money taken away from them, and yet. At the end of last year, the Society of Labour Lawyers did a calendar, and the Howard League was a beneficiary of the calendar's proceeds. But it was 12 months of pictures of court buildings in disrepair.
I have to say,
quite funny and awful.
There's a problem at the moment with recruiting judges in the criminal jurisdiction. And one of the main problems with that is that there aren't enough barristers, because barristers obviously become judges, and there's a dwindling pool of criminal barristers. And it's not surprising, because not only are they struggling on relatively low levels of fees, but having to work in conditions that just really shouldn't be the case. Why would you want to go to work in a place where you're not guaranteed that the ceiling won't fall down in front of you, especially when you could go into the commercial law sector and well, their buildings are nicer, let's be honest.
Yeah, no question about that. Tristan, I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our hour. My apologies to those people whose questions we haven't got through today. This is unfortunately just part and parcel of the online event. But thank you very much for sharing your insights and your experience, for sitting through all of these cases to bring us what's interesting is happening in court and important, and for putting up with these crappy buildings as people do every day. Barristers, judges, court clerks, people working security in court buildings are all dealing with them, but also, witnesses, defendants, victims, having to go to these kind of disrespecter of people places. But we're really grateful. I'm going to clap because no one else can clap. Please, everybody clap for Tristan at home. Ridiculous, but true.
Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. So please follow Tristan. His Twitter feed is extremely illuminating, to say the very least. And that's how we discovered Tristan, through his Twitter feed. So please do follow him if that's your thing. Everybody else, I wish you a very good summer, and take care. Oh, there we go. Rob's put up Tristan's Twitter hashtag, whatever it's called. Please look after yourself in the hot weather. I've basically expired over the course of the last hour. And we will come up with more events for you in the autumn, and we look forward to seeing you at them then. Please have a good summer. We will be in touch soon.